While Genesis is often compared with Mesopotamian myths, such as Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, and Enki and the Magic Hoe, it was also influenced by Egyptian myths. Today, we talk about 3 Egyptian myths that influenced Genesis 1 and 2 on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Assyriologists often comment on the similarities between Mesopotamian myth and Genesis. And I have no doubt that Genesis interacted with those myths. It is also clear that Genesis also interacted with at least 3 Egyptian myths. But before we get into these myths, let's discuss the 1,000-pound elephant in the room, which is, what do we mean by the word interact? There are 2 extreme views of this that are common and inaccurate. The first is that of a complete de novo text of the book of Genesis beamed into the mind of the writer, divorced from its ancient Near Eastern context. And because the religions of men are inherently pagan, God would not have anything to do with that sort of stuff. This is a distortion of the doctrine of inspiration, and is more akin to the automatic writing of UFO cults than Christianity. If you want to learn more about the doctrine of inspiration, please see the video in the card above. The other distorted view is that Genesis is a mere plagiarism of ancient Near Eastern myth. The entire idea of Genesis being a copy is fraught with problems. For example, there is little evidence of verbatim copying. There are vague cultural similarities between myth and Genesis, but there are also many differences and contrasts as well. Avoiding both extremes of a de novo text versus a plagiarized text leaves us with intertextuality as a middle ground. With intertextuality, the biblical writer is aware of ancient Near Eastern myths and is reacting to those myths, either affirming or denying aspects of those myths. No writer lives in a vacuum. All writers read and respond to the ideas around them. So with that foundation, let's now examine 3 Egyptian myths that Genesis 1 and 2 are interacting with. Myth number 1, the Birth of Rey. The myth of the Birth of Rey begins with the idea that in the beginning of the world, all that existed was the primordial waters. There was no land, air, or sky, only water. And the waters brought forth an egg, and hatching from the egg was the falcon sun god Rey. Then Rey ejaculated, producing the god of the air Shu and goddess of moisture Tefnut. Then Tefnut and Shu begat Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. And the birth of these gods coincided with the creation of the world and the origins of the gods, also known as theogony. The point of comparison between this myth and Genesis 1 is in chapter 1, verses 2 and 6. And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." Both the Birth of Rey and Genesis 1 suggest that the earth was entirely covered with water, and that each god had to create the land and the sky from the midst of the waters. The means used by each text is different to that end. The Birth of Rey created the dry land by the creation of the other gods, ergo theogony, while Genesis suggests that God separated the land from the earth by fiat command. Myth number 2, the Memphite Theology. The Memphite Theology appears in only one text, the Shabaka stone. This stone itself appears to have been produced during the 25th dynasty and was a copy of a decaying papyrus that probably dates to Dynasty 19. The theology itself is a kind of contest between two rival cults in Egypt, the cult of Rey at Heliopolis and the cult of Ptah at Memphis. And this document is an apologetic for why the myth of Ptah is so much superior to the myth of Rey. Like Rey, Ptah is a creator god, whose origin is that he was self-created. That is, Ptah willed himself into existence and suddenly he existed. The force of the argument presented in the Shabaka stone is that Ptah created by fiat, and it draws the contrast that Rey has to ejaculate in order to create anything, whereas Ptah creates by the power of his mind and by command of his voice. The point of the Memphite theology is that the theology of Ptah is superior, and therefore more likely to be true, because fiat creation is more befitting of a god, demonstrating more power, the power to create with the power of one's thoughts alone, and is therefore less crude. The point of comparison in Genesis 1 is the repeated refrain, "Let there be X, and there was X." For example, Genesis 1:3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The idea that a god could create by will alone put that god above its rivals. It put Ptah above Rey in Memphis, and it put God above the other gods against whom may have been seen as competition, Baal, Marduk, Amun-Re, etc. Myth number 3, the Canoe Myth. Egypt had many creation myths. Unlike the other creation myths that focus on how the gods and the world came into existence, the Canoe Myth focused on the creation of man. This myth is shown in a variety of temple settings, and it depicts the ram-headed god Canoe sitting at a potter's wheel, and he is fashioning mankind out of clay on the wheel. This compares to Genesis 2:7, which says, "Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." In this passage, God formed mankind from the dirt of the ground. Mankind was not created by fiat, but out of pre-existing matter. Canoe takes the clay and forms the bodies of man and woman, just as a potter makes a pot or an idol. This imagery of mankind being made like an idol also resonates with what is found in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." The words image and likeness have cultic significance. They are words used for idols. God forbade mankind to make idols and worship them, Exodus 20, verse 4, because they are a mockery of what is truly divine. Nevertheless, humans are the walking imagers of God. We were meant to reflect our Creator in all that we do. In conclusion, we have now looked at 3 Egyptian myths that have had intertextuality with the first 2 chapters of Genesis. They were not copies, but rather aspects of each myth were selected out. Those aspects were either affirmed or rejected. The earth was a water world, fiat power of God, and man being formed out of the materials of the earth to be an image of the divine are all aspects of Egyptian myth that Genesis affirms. The polytheism, the theogony of God, and the panentheistic undertones of Egyptian myth would be aspects that Genesis would reject. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting and you learned something today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.